votes that no poll would register. And in any case, he was slowly catching up. By the last week, he had crept into third place. Now, suddenly, the other candidates took notice. The election turned nasty. Johnson was attacked for his youth, for his blind support of Roosevelt, for anything that could be dug up. Trying to win a few votes in Austin, Johnson came up against the political machine of Mayor Miller, who disliked him and did everything possible to sabotage his campaign. Undeterred, Johnson personally visited the mayor several times in that last week to broker some kind of truce. But Miller saw through his charm. His personal appeal might have won over the district's poorest voters, but the other candidates saw a different side of him. He was ruthless and capable of slinging mud. As he rose in the polls, he made more and more enemies. On Election Day, Johnson pulled off one of the greatest upsets in American political history, outdistancing his nearest rival by 3,000 votes. Exhausted by the grueling pace he had set, he was hospitalized. But the day after his victory, he was back at work. He had something extremely important to do. From his hospital bed, Johnson dictated letters to his rivals in the race. He congratulated them for running a great campaign. He also described his own victory as a fluke, a vote for Roosevelt more than for himself. Learning that Miller was visiting Washington, Johnson telegraphed his connections in the city to chaperone the mayor and treat him like royalty. As soon as Johnson left the hospital, he paid visits to his rivals and acted with almost embarrassing humility. He even befriended Polk's brother, driving him around town to run errands. A mere 18 months later, Johnson had to stand for re-election, and these one-time opponents and bitter enemies suddenly turned into the most fervent Johnson believers, donating money, even campaigning on his behalf. And Mayor Miller, the one man who had hated Johnson the most, now became his strongest supporter and remained so for years to come. Interpretation. For most of us, the conclusion of anything, a project, a campaign, an attempt at persuasion, represents a kind of wall. Our work is done, and it is time to tally our gains and losses and move on. Lyndon Johnson looked at the world much differently. An ending was not like a wall, but more like a door, leading to the next phase or battle. What mattered to him was not gaining a victory, but where it left him, how it opened onto the next round. What good would it do to win the election of 1937 if he were thrown out of office 18 months later? That would be a devastating setback to his dream of the presidency. If, after the election, he had basked in his moment of triumph, he would have sown the seeds of failure in the next election. He had made too many enemies. If they didn't run against him in 1938, they would stir up trouble while he was away in Washington. So Johnson immediately worked to win these men over, whether with charm, with meaningful gestures, or with clever appeals to their self-interest. He kept his eye on the future and on the kind of success that would keep him moving forward. Johnson used the same approach in his efforts to win over voters. Instead of trying to persuade people to support him with speeches and fancy words, he was not a good orator anyway, he focused on the feeling he left people with. He knew that persuasion is ultimately a process of the emotions. Words can sound nice, but if a politician leaves people suspecting him of being insincere, of merely plugging for votes, they will close off to him and forget him. So Johnson worked to establish an emotional connection with voters, and he would close his conversations with them with a hearty handshake and with a look in his eye, a tremor in his voice that sealed the bond between them. He left them feeling that they would see him again, and he stirred emotions that would erase any suspicion he might be insincere. The end of the conversation was in fact a kind of beginning, for it stayed in their minds and translated into votes. Understand, in any venture, your tendency to think in terms of winning or losing, success or failure, is dangerous. Your mind comes to a stop instead of looking ahead. Emotions dominate the moment. A smug elation in winning, dejection and bitterness in losing. What you need is a more fluid and strategic outlook on life. Nothing ever really ends How you finish something will influence and even determine what you do next. Some victories are negative. They lead nowhere. And some defeats are positive, working as a wake-up call or lesson. This fluid kind of thinking will force you to put more strategic emphasis on the quality and mood of the ending. It will make you look at your opponents and decide whether you might do better to be generous to them at the end, taking a step back and transforming them into allies, playing on the emotions of the moment. Keeping your eyes on the aftermath of any encounter, you will think more of the feeling you leave people with, a feeling that might translate into a desire to see more of you. By understanding that any victory or defeat is temporary, and that what matters is what you do with them, you will find it easier to keep yourself balanced during the thousands of battles that life entails. The only real ending is death. Everything else is a transition. From Hagakure, the Book of the Samurai, by Yamamoto Tsunetomo. As Yasuda Ukyo said about offering up the last wine cup, only the end of things is important. One's whole life should be like this. When guests are leaving, the mood of being reluctant to say farewell is essential. Keys to warfare. There are three kinds of people in the world. First, there are the dreamers and talkers, who begin their projects with a burst of enthusiasm, but this burst of energy quickly peters out as they encounter the real world and the hard work needed to bring any project to an end. They are emotional creatures who live mainly in the moment. They easily lose interest as something new grabs their attention. Their lives are littered with half-finished projects, including some that barely make it beyond a daydream. Then there are those who bring whatever they do to a conclusion, either because they have to or because they can manage the effort. But they cross the finish line with distinctly less enthusiasm and energy than they had starting out. This mars the end of the campaign. Because they are impatient to finish, the ending seems hurried and patched together, and it leaves other people feeling slightly unsatisfied. It is not memorable, does not last, has no resonance. Both of these types begin each project without a firm idea of how to end it. And as the project progresses, inevitably differing from what they had imagined it would be, they become unsure how to get out of it, and either give up or simply rush to the end. The third group comprises those who understand a primary law of power and strategy. The end of something, a project, a campaign, a conversation, has inordinate importance for people. It resonates in the mind. A war can begin with great fanfare and can bring many victories, but if it ends badly, that is all anyone remembers. Knowing the importance and the emotional resonance of the ending of anything, people of the third type understand that the issue is not simply finishing what they have started, but finishing it well, with energy, a clear head, and an eye on the afterglow, the way the event will linger in people's minds. These types invariably begin with a clear plan. When setbacks come, as setbacks will, they are able to stay patient and think rationally. They plan not just to the end, but past it, to the aftermath. These are the ones who create things that last. A meaningful piece, a memorable work of art, a long and fruitful career. The reason it is hard to end things well is simple. Endings inspire overpowering emotions. At the end of a bitter conflict, we have a deep desire for peace, an impatience for the truce. If the conflict is bringing us victory, we often succumb to delusions of grandeur, or are swept by greed and grab for more than we need. If the conflict has been nasty, anger moves us to finish with a violent, punitive strike. If we lose, we are left with a burning desire for revenge. Emotions like these can ruin all of our prior good work. There is, in fact, nothing harder in the realm of strategy than keeping our head on straight all the way to the end and past the end. Yet nothing is more necessary. Napoleon Bonaparte was perhaps the greatest general that ever lived. His strategies were marvels of combined flexibility and detail, and he planned all the way to the end. But after defeating the Austrians at Austerlitz, and then the Prussians at Jena-Auerstedt, his two greatest victories, he imposed on these nations harsh terms, intended to make them weakened satellites of France. Accordingly, in the years after the treaties, both countries harbored a powerful desire for revenge.